and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Last month, the NGO Pusat Komas released the annual Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report for 2019. Now, this is the 5th edition of the report being produced, and it highlights 7 different trends of racial discrimination in Malaysia, including racial and religious politics, racism in education, and xenophobic behaviour. Joining us in the studio tonight to share more about this 70-page report, we have Jerald Joseph. He's one of the commissioners for the National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, better known as Suhakam. He's also an advisor to Pusat Komas. Jerald, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to talk to you. This report is from last year, right? But it's the 5th edition, so to speak. What exactly is this report used for, Jerald? Why compile all instances of racial discrimination in Malaysia?
Well, to move away from not speaking about the topic, the old Malaysia, if that term is still around, everything was swept under the carpet and called sensitive. So we thought the best way is to document and not to celebrate. We can't celebrate. It's actually a painful report because it tells us as Malaysians this is who we are, but not all of us, because the first chapter is a good news chapter. People actually resist against such trends, but it's a capture by media who has caught it in different parts of the country. So scrolling through of online, offline, I mean, if it's come on Astro, and then that will be also recorded as a news piece. So the data comes from the news piece media, as well as there's an app, report racism app in Komas, as well as from Suhakam. If there's a racial discrimination report, is also captured in this report.
Well, you know, what's interesting is that you're using the media as a kind of a way in which to measure and to quantify perhaps even, instances of racism. But, Jerald, I wonder if, many Malaysians will say, well, we all know racism exists and, it's just part of life, it's just there. There's a level which racism operates, or racial thinking, if you like, or just stereotypes, sometimes benign, stereotypes that people kind of accept, and maybe they will think, why bother? We all know that racism exists, and so the question is the impact of such a report.
So I think if we don't do it, then it's, why bother? But to challenge the why bother, which we think is norm, and this conversation of Malay, Chinese, Indian is actually a very Semenanjung conversation.
Right. You
move over to Sabah and Sarawak, I'm sure later Dr. Madeline will say something about it. They don't have that conversations, and then we're wondering how come it's here, how did it come here? And it's not about that it's here, but it actually impacts and affects all levels of society, from the high policy position, governance, to the daily interaction with you and me on the street or trying to rent a room. I'm not sure, Sharaad, you will get it easy to rent a room, depends on who the owner is. And so it has an impact on our lives. And what about job employment?
Right.
Are we actually daring enough to say that because of our merit, because of our qualification, there's nothing else that colors the mind of the employer? So these are things that are not discussed, and I think it's time we put it on the table, and I think that's what the report is, for anybody to use it for a discussion and to take Malaysia away from this. Our hope one day is that if the list is long, as you're right, it's only from capturing what's written, there's lots more not written. One day hopefully we can say that it's decreasing, but at this point it's every corner is still blazing.
You're absolutely right that often the conversation about racial discrimination is limited to the peninsula. We are going to be speaking to development economist Madeline Berma shortly, but I want to ask you what's interesting about this particular report, it being the 5th edition. It also provided a look back, a 5-year review of racial discrimination in Malaysia. Jerald, have things gotten better in the last 5 years, or have they gotten worse?
I would say that last year's report it was in a different dimension, because now that you are in another political dimension, you sort of look back and said we had a different space where we were a bit more comfortable and no one was chastising you for bringing up the topic. And so the first chapter actually captured much more of people speaking against racism or racial discrimination. And just to give you some examples, it has moved from even former ministers like Khairi Jamaluddin.
Oh, you've brought the report, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
so
Okay.
I brought the report. But who actually called out the former minister, YB Kula, for seemingly having said that you should vote the Indian community one of the by-elections. So I said, oh, that was fantastic. An UMNO minister calling out opposition, well, a former opposition minister, a minister of housing, saying that we're going to have a policy so that you cannot rent or build houses based on racial quota. And the election commission, former chairperson who's now the speaker, said considers deleting race section on electoral roll. Okay. So it is even the past youth chief said make Mandarin and Tamil compulsory in primary schools.
So there are instances of positive development when it comes to addressing racial discrimination.
Exactly.
But overall, what would you say?
So I think the space created for such conversation mean that the instances of racism and racial discrimination continued to grow. And I think you and I remembered the anti-ISET rally, you know. It sort of grew an explosion, and suddenly they would say, it's you are going to take away my Malay right or Islamic right. And that's not true at all. I think you all discussed this at some point. So I think in every segment from political parties, from the parliament, we had captured such painful discussion. Sadly, it's still continuing in the recent parliament, you know.
Jerald, to what extent, is this report taking international yardsticks and measures and definitions as a way in which to frame a Malaysian conversation or Malaysian practices?
Yeah. So I think we need a sort of an objective test, which is probably a normative minimum standard. And I'm going to use the word here, the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ICED, only as a standard for us to ask questions about ourselves, Malaysia. So there is a definition on what racial discrimination is. So they give you the grounds of discrimination based on language, on ethnicity, on belief. You know, so the list is long. So it's very clear. So you can use that, and there's propaganda against it. You can use that. So the definition is an international definition, but the question of how you and I read it, of course, we may disagree. That is not racism. That is racism. But I think that's the whole reason of this conversation.
Right.
The more you suppress what's happening, example, we may have seen the banner, no foreigners to come in some condos in Malaysia. So, but we've said, okay, too bad, and we move on. But that should never be allowed to exist, you know, but they still get away. I don't know whose role, power.
Well, that is a very interesting point that you've made, and we do want to come back and talk a little bit about, normalized racism in Malaysia. But we're going to take a quick break. After this, we're going to cross over to development economist Madeline Berma for a better understanding of racism and racial discrimination in Sabah and Sarawak. So stay with us on Consider This. Hi, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad, Kuttan. We're discussing Pusat Komas' Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report for 2019. Joining us on the line now, we have Associate Professor Dr. Madeline Berma. She's a Fellow with the Academy of Science. So welcome to the show, Madeline. Now, often when we talk about racial discrimination, it is a very Peninsular Malaysia-centric conversation. There is this kind of popular perception that Peninsula has a monopoly on race and racial fault lines, and that the territories of Sabah and Sarawak are, largely unburdened by issues of racial discrimination. I want to ask you, Madeline, is this in fact the reality on the ground there?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on that. Okay, basically what I want to share here is that unlike Semenanjung Malaysia, we have different levels, okay? When you talk about racial discrimination, it's not like what you have in Peninsular Malaysia. In Peninsular Malaysia, the narrative has always been on the ethnic issue of China, India, Melayu, CIM, and lately I include another one, B, Bangladesh. Okay, so that's one layer. But in Semenanjung, in Sabah and Sarawak, the issue of discrimination comes not in the form of, or rather in the kind of narrative that has been discussed here in Peninsula. Our layer is a bit different because of what we call, there is a lot of intermarriages. We have, as far as that is concerned, I think we are slightly or definitely more tolerant than our, or rather accepting as compared to the Peninsula Malaysia in terms of discussion. But we do have all the other discrimination, although some people say it's subtle, some say that it is not seen because it is, there is a layer to it. For example, in the civil service, for example, in the education system, in terms of social, if you look at the issues about religion and politics, it is there, except that the way it's being discussed and how it's been, or rather put in a manner so that it is not like what you have here in Peninsular Malaysia. So what I'm trying to say here is that we do have, except that it is in a different manner to that what is being, or rather the narrative in Peninsular Malaysia.
Okay, so
I'll start with that.
So Madeline, so it might be different, but it still could be a problem. And I understand that if we in Malaysia have an issue around foreign workers, and you mentioned the Bangladeshi community in particular, in Sabah you have the question of Pakistanis. And I know that is raised often in popular discourse. And also you have the difference between Kadazan Dusun nationalism, the acceptance or non-acceptance of Suluk people. These are real because they have an impact on people. Maybe you could talk to that. To what extent these fault lines in Sabah and Sarawak have real negative impact on the individuals and their life chances?
Okay, as I said just now, let me just recall what I said. The kind of discussion that we have in Sabah and Sarawak is not Melayu, Cina, India. That for us is a very peninsular kind of discussion. But you're right when you say that, we do discuss, we talk about documented and undocumented persons. We do have people, as you rightly mentioned, the Pakistanis in Sabah and the Suluk, and in Sarawak we do have, there's an issue of, Indonesians. So there is a discussion at that level, but it's unlike what you have in Peninsular Malaysia. Yours is more complex. Ours, in a way, is quite straightforward. So it's not really, when we, there is a tendency to use Sabah and Sarawak as a benchmark. And we used to say that, in Sabah and Sarawak, you have a fantastic, there is a harmonious relationship. Everybody is, buddy-buddy with each other. But actually, if you go to the second layer, you go to the third layer, there are big issues. But for example, I raised this, the concept of lain-lain. This is something that we in Sabah and Sarawak really took into account, the fact that why are we being defined as lain-lain in the context of a bigger Malaysia? So that is the kind of narrative we had when we deal with China, Melayu, India. But when we talk about another layer, that is when we talk about you mentioned, the Pakistanis, the Suluk, Kadazan Dusun, Iban, Bidayu, and things like that. The kind of discussion is a bit different. It comes, and this is where politics comes in. Okay? When you talk about politics, then people start defining themselves by their ethnicity.
I want to ask you about that, Madeline, about the role of politics in this. Whether politicians actually use these divisions, these kind of undertones of racial nuances in their political discourse, sometimes dog whistling and not really, in terms, especially in Sabah and Sarawak. Is there instances of that there?
I don't even want to say nuances. To me, it's blatant. If you look at the social media, I have 9 WhatsApp groups. I am in 9 WhatsApp groups, all related to politics, and all the message is just Iban and Dayak. This has never happened before. So the social media is bringing to the front things that we have never really thing is happening in Sabah and Sarawak. I'm only talking about Iban. I have not even discussed on other ethnic groups. So this issue, when we bring to fore the what we call the social media and politics, now we see it is more open. Whether we want to say there is more openness, or on the other hand, we are also learning from our friends in Peninsular Malaysia. So that's the joke that we have now. We said, I always use this term, we are Bumi Putra or are we Bunyi Putra?
Bunyi
You know,
Putra.
these are
But the question is,
Bunyi
Madeline,
Putra.
is the competition and about access to state resources, access to positions in the bureaucracy, ability to get business licenses or contracts from the state, is that where race is in fact most salient in Sabah and Sarawak?
In a way, yes. But it has been really, I mean, in terms of you look at, that was one of my criticism against the Malaysian Racial Discrimination Report 2019. They covered almost everything, 7 areas, but all focus on Peninsular Malaysia. They have not really did an analysis at our mainstream media and social media, because all these are happening, but that the report does not cover that. So that is also one thing that I did mention when we were discussing the report. So these are happening, access to resources. I am with Suhakam. The kind of complaints that we have are related to NCR land, related to religious freedom. We're talking also about access to resources, access to opportunities. We're talking about equality. We're talking about poverty, the high incidence of poverty among the indigenous, the orang asal. So whether we like it or not, it is there. But I'm glad that we have this report, because it brings to the front things where we don't really dare discuss in the past, like we don't dare to say, racist remarks or whatever it is. It is there. And also, like we used to say that, Sabah and Sarawak are really, they have the best example. But as I said just now, the way the narrative is a bit different from that in Semenanjung Malaysia. But definitely, I hope that the other Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report 2020, we will bring this issue out, the case of Sabah and Sarawak, though not in the kind of discussion the way that they have right now, based on, it's only on Peninsula, on social, what has been discussed in social media and mainstream media. I would like to see more of Sabah and Sarawak in the report.
Well, Madeline, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
So
we really appreciate your time. Now we're going to take a quick break on Consider This, but we'll be back with more on this topic in just a few minutes. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Jerald Joseph. He's one of the commissioners of Suhakam. This is about Pusat Komas's Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report 2019, the 5th year of its publication. Jerald, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to some of the things that we heard Madeline bring up in our chat a little bit earlier. Do you have anything to say to her criticism that this report missed out Sabah and Sarawak?
So I think she was spot on. The only way to capture things that are not written in the newspaper or media is to actually listen to airwaves elsewhere. So she mentioned WhatsApp, community conversations, and it's happening. And I think Dr. Madeline put it very well. Just because it's not like the Malay, Chinese, Indian conversation doesn't mean it does not happen. I think sadly Malaysia, both sides of the sea, South China Sea, has used ethnic identity as a premium for political survival or political win. So that's in Semenanjung, the outdoing of each other, who's the more Malay party, more Chinese, Indian party. And I think we're going to see that happen in Sabah. I hope not in this coming elections. And that's what she's trying to say, that while it's not pronounced, but the question I think you asked about the suluk issue, so identity still will draw people, and I think we've not broken out of that yet.
Yeah, but Jerald, when you look worldwide, I mean, even in, and I say even because Europe stands as a kind of so-called beacon of modernity, which modern politics should get beyond identity. But in fact, we see in many European countries a retreat to identity-based populism. We see it in Hungary and so on and so forth, right? Some form of nationalism that has an ethnic core, for instance. Britain has that around the Brexit debate. So why do we think in Malaysia that we want to graduate from this? When the rest of the world is constantly in a struggle about this as well, why is it that we somehow naively think that we do the right thing, we do the documentation, and we put out the right messages, that we will overcome the kind of identity politics that we see throughout the world?
Well, why ape countries that are struggling and pulling down each other? The examples they have given in Europe, US, they have ups and downs. They celebrate in Obama, and then the very next instance, a president who denigrates everybody else except himself. And Europe has also gone through that. But that's the populist politics. Where can elder statesmen or women stand up beyond that and say that Malaysian first? We had this debate in Parliament some years ago. How many of us feel Malaysian? I think that's what Dr. Madeline said. The done line box is boxing us up, If we took away that, don't we have a Malaysian box that we feel that's our first affiliation? And I think sometimes when you ask that question, the reaction is, well, these things are there, but when we play badminton, when Chong Wei plays, we'll all cheer.
Yes.
But after that game ends, when we walk out the door, I've seen people make comments about each other in a football game. Football is full. I was there, Malaysia, I forgot what game. But after that, you're just going separately and they're making all kinds of comments. I'm wondering, that's a moment, or is that a lapse? Or actually, that's the real moment. So
that's a really good point, because I was wondering about, you have official definitions of what constitutes racism, racial discrimination. But I'm wondering whether there is a gap between those official definitions and popular understandings or popular perceptions of racism. If we ourselves don't recognize what we're doing is racist, then how do we affect change?
Yeah, so that's why we sometimes wonder if there were a few leaders. That's why I said that the last space we had, the political opening of the Malaysia Baru, and it was for all. It's not about PH or all government, everybody was in that mood that, okay, it's time for reform. And that opened up a new space for rebranding who we were, And that's when we could have the conversation about identity. I think what has not happened now is, again, that sadly there's still this contestation, and that's why I think, why should we be in the European backpedaling? We don't have to follow them,
Yeah, I do understand that, and I appreciate the kind of work that Komas has done over the years. I remember a movie many years ago that he produced called Gado, and more recently, Zuna, I think in a comic book, also tried to take up what he believes is the core of racial thinking and racial discrimination, and try to break it down, somehow help young people as well as just ordinary Malaysians break down through the use of comics these kind of perceptions. Are they effective tools, Jerald, to actually start that conversation and push it beyond conversations to something like best practices and take something that's acceptable and make it unacceptable if it in fact is racist?
So I think the first is documenting the courage of Malaysians, and I think that's why the first chapter of this Komas Racial Discrimination Report is putting out people who dare speak against the tide. Because the populist one is you say, oh yeah, I'm a champion of my gang. That's not difficult to do that. But those who stand up and say, sorry, I don't think that's right, you cannot call out xenophobic behavior. And if in Parliament, the shouting down of Gelap and the ash, that should not happen, I think. So I think calling out is one tool, and the report does that. Number two is educational tool. So Gado movie is one of it. There are other short documentaries, some excellent movies. We always feel very emotional when we see that Petronas Raya.
Every time it's Merdeka, we all get a little bit more national unity.
Yeah, it's coming. So, but I'm saying that if we had more of that, and that should be in our big billboards, the
Okay.
10 seconds on Astro, and that I think could be
Can I
emotional.
ask you, Jerald, about legislative change? Is legislation the way to affect societal change? Do we need a National Harmony Act? Is that the way to get rid of racial discrimination?
So I think you need the full gamut. No way about forgetting and closing your eyes. We have laws, but that law should go, Sedition Act. Using that does not resolve the root cause. So there was a proposal actually from Prime Minister Najib's time, the National Unity Consultative Council, taken on by Pakatan Harapan, who also agreed, and now I don't know where it's gone. One of it is to have a National Harmony Commission, an independent commission that can mediate, that has the powers to sanction. The hate bills, the hate speech bill that was under discussion as sort of a new formula on. So we need some sanctions, but I think we also need some soft approach for dialogue and discussion. As it stands now, the soft approach is not addressing the root cause. The soft approach is jom makan durian or makan kenduri, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Not enough.
Not enough.
Just very recently, and we're coming into a very political season, potentially a general election, and Hadi Awang from PAS has said that he's hoping that this election produces a Malay government. Now, are you concerned that in the politics that's going to unfold as a result of the general election, we'll actually see a heightening of racialized conversations and racial practices?
Sadly, it will be as the normal practice, but I'm hoping that there will, that's why I said statesmen and stateswomen who will stand up beyond this and not see for the short term. So when Hadi Awang MP, Dr. Hadi Awang said a more Malay government, then I'll ask which Malay? Who's the Malay? We have ethnic Malay, we have political Malay, we have second, third generation. So, and the Malays are not one polity, one unity. So I would desist against using ethnicity, because we will never end. We will be going in a circle. We will go back to Europe, as I think what you're trying to suggest, Sharaad. But I think ours is a challenge on how to overcome this, and a little bit disappointing for members of parliament at this age to still think it's a premium to sell ethnicity and racialism.
Right.
Yeah.
Jerald, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure talking to you
Thank
tonight.
you. Thank you.
That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.